we're going to talk about this rising threat from Japan that's going to lead to something we know in history as Pearl Harbor. And so, while the war was raging on in Europe, Japan was in the Pacific basically trying to push its conquests in the Far East. And by July of 1941, Japanese troops had occupied an area known as French Indochina. So by July of 1941, Japanese troops occupied an area known as French Indochina. Does anybody know where that is or what makes up French Indochina? What's that? Vietnam, Korea, that particular area, the Philippine Islands, those types of things, are all considered French Indochina. And the reason it was called French Indochina, because not a lot of people know this, for example, Vietnam was under French control until like the 1950s, and then it kind of metamorphosized in kind of a mess when North Vietnam tried to conquer South Vietnam and make them communist, and the United States said, no, we're not going to have that. We got ourselves in a conflict. Well, President Roosevelt was very alarmed when Japanese troops occupied French Indochina. And so what he did is he immediately froze all Japanese assets in the United States. So as Roosevelt found out about the Japanese troops occupying French Indochina, he's very alarmed, and as a result, to protest their actions, he froze all Japanese assets in the United States. What does that mean when you freeze someone's assets? Their money is not worth anything, right, for trade. He also not only froze their assets, he also placed an embargo on any shipment of gasoline or machine tools or scrap iron or steel to Japan. So he not only froze their assets in the United States in protest of their troops occupying French Indochina, he also placed an embargo. And an embargo is a ban on trade. He placed an embargo on the shipment of any gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel to Japan. And Japan depended on the United States for those materials. They were not big producers of gasoline or machine tools or scrap iron or steel. And so Roosevelt knew that hurt him a little bit, so he placed an embargo on those products, along with freezing the Japanese assets in the United States, in protest of Japanese troops occupying French Indochina. Now, Japan promptly retaliated against the United States by freezing all American assets in Japan and any areas they control. So we all of a sudden have a standstill in trade between the United States and Japan on both sides. So Japan retaliates with Roosevelt's actions by freezing all American assets in their country, and basically what happened as a result of this is trade between the United States and Japan came to a standstill. Now, it was at this time, when I mentioned yesterday, that Japanese General Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan. So he's not only serving as a general in the military, because we said the military controlled Japan during this time, Tojo also becomes Prime Minister in 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor. Okay? Well, relations are not going very well, and on November 20th of 1941, the Japanese government made 3 demands upon the United States. On November 20th, 1941, the Japanese government, including Tojo, made 3 demands upon the United States. What do you think one of their demands might have been? I'm thinking about what we said. Well, close. They didn't demand the embargo be lifted, but they did demand that the United States had to supply Japan with all the gasoline they needed. So they didn't talk about the machine tools and the steel and the scrap iron. They basically told the United States, you know, we demand that you supply us with as much gasoline as we need. What else might they have demanded that the United States do? That it wasn't the embargo part. unfreeze the Japanese assets. So they demanded that the United States unfreeze the Japanese assets. The third one probably irritated the United States more, and the third demand was that the Japanese government said that the United States must cease all aid to China. Could not give any more aid to China because China was an enemy of Japan. So the three demands that the Japanese government placed upon the United States on November 20th, 1941, number one, they demanded the United States unfreeze Japanese assets in our country. They demanded that we supply Japan with as much gasoline as they needed, and they demanded that we cease all aid to China. Well, obviously, we're not going to meet any of these demands, but we are going to offer some counter proposals. Okay, that's negotiation. So the United States refuses to meet these demands, but they offer several counter proposals. Well, when they receive our counter proposals, the Japanese announced publicly that further negotiations with the United States is useless. And they gave two reasons why that they were no longer willing to negotiate with the United States. So the Japanese announced that further negotiations are useless. They will not try to negotiate any further with the United States for these two reasons.
Wait, what were our...
What's that? I don't know. Didn't matter. They didn't like any of them, really. So after listing the counter proposals, which they didn't like, they announced that further negotiations were useless for these two reasons. One, they stated publicly that the United States clung to, quote, impractical principles. They stated publicly, the Japanese government did, that the United States clung to, quote, impractical principles. The United States clung to, quote, impractical principles. The second thing they announced, their reasoning for no more negotiations with the United States, is they stated that the United States had failed, quote, to display in the slightest degree a spirit of conciliation. They stated that the United States had failed to, quote, display in the slightest degree a spirit of conciliation. Okay, the United States had failed to display in the slightest degree a spirit of conciliation. What's conciliation? Well, they failed to display in the slightest degree a spirit of conciliation. A spirit of conciliation would be try to reconcile, would be try to compromise, would be try to negotiate fairly. So they basically just said we weren't willing to be reasonable. So after they made these statements, they began their plans for an attack against the United States. So the Japanese, after making these statements and refusing to further negotiate with the United States, began to make their plans for an attack upon the United States. And that's where we'll quit today, and we'll talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor tomorrow, and we'll watch a little debate. How many people watched a little or some of this or all of this debate? Okay. Okay, Will, if you'd get the door, please, and the lights.